Weeks of protests and calls for Nicaragua's president to resign. Could this be the end of the Sandinista revolution? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Daniel Ortega. Well, it began with the president's attempts to overhaul Nicaragua's welfare system, judiciary, and police. Unhappy with the proposed changes, opponents took to the streets. And when police cracked down, protests against Social Security cuts morphed into an uprising against the government. It's not that Daniel Ortega isn't without supporters. The 72-year-old president held a mass rally in the capital, Managua, on Monday, with loyalists and government workers defending his administration. But with dozens of protesters now dead, Ortega may find it hard to reconcile with his opposition. So could this be the end of the Sandinista revolutionaries' hold on power? Or is Nicaragua's worst political unrest in 30 years winding down? Christine Perovolakis reports.
No a la muerte. No a la destrucción. No a la violencia. No a la barbarie. Sí a la vida. Sí al diálogo. Sí al trabajo. Sí a la paz.
After deaths in the streets, Nicaraguan President Daniel Ortega is determined to not go quietly, or perhaps even at all, while thousands of supporters rallied in support of the president on Monday. A day earlier, thousands more called for his resignation.
Y para protestar ante el mundo y ante este gobierno criminal, asesino, que cruelmente ha asesinado a la población.
The demands followed a police crackdown on protesters that lasted for days. Human rights activists say at least 63 people were killed and hundreds were wounded by gunfire. Many are reported to have gone missing during the protests, and there are accusations young detainees have been tortured. The rallies were called after the government announced changes to the pension program, which would force workers to pay more for Social Security but receive fewer benefits. After 4 days of violence, the government finally gave in.
El Consejo Directivo de la Seguridad Social lo que está haciendo es revocando, o sea, cancelando.
Ortega accused the opposition of trying to overthrow the government. He also accused protesters of killing each other. Daniel Ortega is considered to be the last of Latin America's revolutionaries. And for 22 of the past 39 years, he has ruled Nicaragua, one of the poorest countries in the region, with an iron fist. Ortega has faced protests before, but none of this scale since his re-election 11 years ago. Critics accuse him of interfering in the judiciary and private businesses. They also say Ortega is trying to build a family dynasty by creating a path for his wife, who is currently vice president, to become Nicaragua's next leader. Now, Ortega has agreed to talks mediated by the church. But students at the forefront of anti-government protests want things on their own terms. That includes establishing an independent UN-backed body to investigate the violence, and not one created by the government. Students are also demanding that police involved in the violence be fired. The recent unrest is the largest since the end of Nicaragua's civil war nearly 30 years ago. And the manner in which Ortega handles the crisis will help determine the path the country is likely to take in the years to come. Christine Perovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is the spokesman for the Nicaragua Solidarity Campaign Action Group, James Polk. Also in the UK, Natasha Ezro. She is a professor of Latin American politics at the University of Essex and the author of Dictators and Dictatorships, Understanding Authoritarian Regimes and Their Leaders. And in San Jose, California, Nicaraguan activist Brandon Quintanilla. Thanks all so much for joining us. I'm going to start with you, James, in London. You feel the government of Daniel Ortega has served its people quite well. You've also said that reports of police using excessive force, you find them rather hard to believe. If that's the case, why is the perception from outside so different?
I think that, I haven't said that the police haven't used excessive force. There certainly seems to be evidence that they have, although it's a bit of a mystery why they would have done, because the police has been a very trusted institution in Nicaragua for a long time. I'm into Granera until a few days ago. The chief of police in Nicaragua has regularly been voted one of the most popular people in the country, and community relations between police and the general public in Nicaragua have been very good in what is the safest country in Latin America and one of the safest countries in the hemisphere. But clearly, there has been a sudden outbreak of violence, and there does seem to be strong evidence that the police have used excessive violence, including the use of weapons.
Okay, but tell us then your take on Ortega's government. It's being criticized heavily now, particularly by some of the protesters we've seen in the streets, as well as by some forces in the international media. Why do you think his government has been effective and good for the Nicaraguan people?
Well, at the time that the government came back to power, the FSLN, the Sandinista party, came back to power in 2007, the country was in a considerable mess. There were power cuts on a daily basis. A large part of the country was cut off from basic services, sanitation, general utilities. That has massively improved. The country has been growing regularly over the last 7 or 8 years, an average of about 5% per year. There's been a very good tripartite agreement between the government, business leaders and the trade unions to make sure that the country works well, to support private enterprise, whilst at the same time allow the possibility of a great deal of attention to supporting social programs and alleviating poverty. I mean, poverty has been cut by 50%, from 48% to 24.9% over the last 10 years. Extreme poverty has been cut by more than that. There have been huge programs supporting people, providing support for women in particular. Nicaragua is now, according to the World Economic Forum, the 6th best country in the world for gender equality, up from 88th in 2007. So there are massive areas where things have improved. I think maybe where the problem is that a certain amount of complacency has come in. The opposition is very weak, and for a well-functioning democracy, you actually need a strong opposition. So I think there have been probably certain cases where there have been abuses of power and sectors of the community that feel that they've not been supported by the government where they should have been.
Okay, Brandon, let me ask you, you're in California now, but most of your family, from what I've understood, is still in Nicaragua. Having heard what James just said, I mean, does Daniel Ortega deserve what looks to be more and more like an uprising to remove him from power?
I can agree on the fact that he should be withdrawn, only because of all the things that I'm hearing constantly from my family members, because I have family members that are attending the universities, and they're the ones doing the nonviolent protesting. So one of my cousins was actually assaulted for doing nonviolent protesting, aggressive through the police force. And so that kind of led to him getting arrested, and due to the fact that he's speaking up and voicing his opinions about the corruption of what they feel about what they felt was incorrect, what they did. So in my input, I feel like he should be withdrawn.
Okay, but Brandon, let me ask you, you say, you're talking about the corruption and what they feel the government did. Is it about corruption? Do they disapprove of Ortega's administration? Or were they mad at what was initially the cause of these protests and those cuts to Social Security and welfare?
Yeah, it's the cuts for sure. I mean, if you're a retired person that's already living in a country of poverty, which compared economically to where we come from, like in the United States, if you have your pension, it's a lot of hard-earned money. But in a country where it's already poverty, it's not a lot of money in comparison. So having 5% being withdrawn after doing all your hard work and labor to contribute to the economy, and seeing how that plays out, it's just unfortunate. So
okay, but now that Ortega has repealed those cuts, he's gone back on that, shouldn't he be able to reconcile?
He could, but it varies, because there's a lot of confrontation that the people are asking for, and solutions on how they can go about the tension with the Sandinistas and the actual government itself.
Okay, let me get to Natasha now. I mean, what do you see has happened here, and where do you think this is going?
In some ways, it's surprising that that there were protests in Nicaragua because, as it already been stated, Nicaragua had been pretty stable for many years, and there were growth rates, and it was attracting a lot of FDI. But in other ways, it's not very surprising because Ortega's regime has become more and more personalized, more like a family dictatorship, which is sort of reminiscent of the Somoza years, which is exactly what the Nicaraguan people would not want. And corruption levels have grown over the years. And he seems to be grooming his wife, who's now the vice president, to take over eventually. And there's just this feeling that really high levels of nepotism and cronyism in Nicaragua. And so we'll see how things play out because he seems to be wanting to concede to these protests and at least take back what initially started the protest. But the bigger problem is for Nicaragua's future is that there isn't really a fair playing field in these elections. And so if he's doing such a good job, he should allow elections to be run fairly and allow international observers to actually observe these elections.
And I mean, I do very much understand that criticism that perhaps opposition hasn't been allowed to flourish in a way that it should, but there's also the question, is there a good enough opposition? Is there a political alternative to Daniel Ortega, or is he the best Nicaragua can do?
Well, I mean, part of the problem is, so he used to be more of a leftist, and he's moved to the center more, and so he occupies a large sort of ideological space. Then the other issue, he's been really successful at dividing and conquering the opposition. And so he's been able to co-opt them at times, repress them at times, provide different carrots and sticks to the opposition so that they really pose no real threat to him. And honestly, he probably could win an election without having to resort to all these dirty tricks that he does. And so that's another issue, that the opposition might need to take note of what's taking place and, move forward with this.
Okay, I mean, James, let me ask you, do you think Ortega can kind of take these protests? Is he at the point now where he can take these protests as a warning shot and claw back kind of, the support that he may have lost, maybe apologize to the public, not let his wife use so many derogatory terms for the protesters, for example, calling them delinquents and vampires? Is it still possible for him to redeem himself now and become the leader that Nicaragua wants him to be and that you obviously think he was?
Well, I think so. As the old Sandinista Jaime Wheelock has been quoted recently saying the thing about Daniel is when he's wrong, he backs down. I think he does want to cooperate. He's a very canny politician. He doesn't stand on his pride. And I think it's very important for him to find a genuine solution. I mean, I think he's also a very genuine politician. He genuinely wants the best for his people. No doubt he's been very shocked by this. I mean, I would agree with some of what Natasha says and not other things. I mean, I think the idea of Daniel Ortega as being somewhat authoritarian and anti-democratic, which has been claimed to a greater or lesser degree by the media in the West, is not really correct. There are certain irregularities. The weakness of the opposition is largely down to the opposition, who can't seem to agree on pretty much anything. So it's been very easy for the FSLN to create a dominant position in the polls, especially given that their policies tend to benefit the majority of the population. But I think the main question is where it goes from here. The question of whether the dialogue and the Truth Commission, which has been set up to try and deal with these issues, whether they are genuine, whether Ortega can make sure that everybody makes a genuine contribution, and whether things really change as a result.
And let me pick up with Brandon again then there. I mean, where does this go from here? Right now, these protests are strong. They're largely peaceful. But there really are, what's so interesting about it, there really are no movement leaders. This is all civic-led protests. I mean, everyone seems to be equally involved across the board. So what would your alternative be as a Nicaraguan? What do you want to see change?
Well, it's a very good question, because there's a lot of areas that there's a lot of tension being brought upon. You know, you have the police that are trying to inflict, they're trying to calm the activists, they're trying to calm the protesting, but then the protesters feel like there's a lot of that needs to be voiced, and I feel like there's a lot of things going on that's kind of making it difficult for everyone to coincide and work side by side. So for me, it's kind of like, you know, actually respecting the ones that are actually trying to rehabilitate the communities, because there's a lot of people in the communities that are trying to obtain awareness. They're raising campaigns. They're obtaining resources from the United States, food, water, and resources. But, you know, I've seen content. I have family members that have identified people looting, but not even just the Sandinistas, but there's actually, you know, police that are actually coming in and taking some of the resources, and there's actual content and footage from people that I have that actually operate nonprofit businesses back home that have been victims to that. So it's very controversial because you have different angles and different people not really working coincide together. So
right, and what you're talking about, in a sense, has something to do with some kind of criminal elements in the community, and just people individuals that behave badly. That's not really the government's problem, though. Am I correct in hearing you?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just me raising awareness to the Sandinistas, because for me, I'm still learning more about how the Sandinistas are playing their part on the corruption in this situation, because they're the ones inflicting all the chaos and all the violence, and you know, it's also the police are getting them confused from the rest of the civilians because you can't really separate the two. So I mean, there's just, from my standpoint, is just President Ortega just has to be genuine about his approach on what he wants to do and his solution.
Okay.
Because, you know, there's a lot of spotlight on him right now. So,
Natasha, let me ask you this. I mean, we're just trying to get a better picture for our viewers that are unfamiliar with Nicaragua. How divided is the country right now?
Well, it's hard to say, right, because there were protests that recently happened that I guess he and the Sandinistas orchestrated that were in favor of the government. If you took the last election as free and fair, which it probably wasn't, but just to look at how popular he was in the last election, Ortega won with 72% of the vote. And the previous election, 5 years before that, he won with 62% of the vote. So he probably has some genuine support, because there are a lot of people that work for the state and, you know, and work for the government that basically feel that they've been beneficiaries of the regime. But the issue that initiated with the students was just being fed up with the style of rule and what the future was going to look like for them, just let alone the fact that their pensions could be cut and there's higher taxes, so there's basically less services being offered. But just the nature of the regime was becoming more and more personalized, with it becoming more of a family dynasty. So just to answer the question of how divided it is, it does look fairly divided at the moment, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a potential solution if, you know, there's an adequate response to the reforms, and also just sort of an easing towards more more democracy on behalf of the Ortega regime, improving press freedoms, and also just allowing a more level playing field for opposition candidates to run.
Okay.
And then also just providing more transparency.
Okay, let me ask James then, as an Ortega supporter, I mean, what steps do you think he should take now? And I want to bring up the point that Natasha raised, is that there's no real proof of this yet, but many people suspect he's just grooming his wife, almost Mugabe-like, to take the reins of power when he steps aside. So what should he do now? Well, I can imagine you don't think that would be okay, to hand the reins and keep this like a family dynasty, or do you?
No, I think it was a grave mistake to appoint her as vice president, or as the vice presidential candidate, and then to run on his ticket. Most countries have either laws against that or certainly disapprove of it, although the President of the United States has slightly fallen foul of that with his son-in-law. But certainly I think it's a bad idea. Rosario Murillo was quite popular before, I think, but her popularity has gone down, and I think it's possibly been held below the waterline as a result of
and he needs to recognize
protests.
That, correct?
I think he needs to recognize that, and I think she probably needs to step back, and I think we probably need to be looking for younger people within the FSLN movement, which is, I mean, obviously it's a very large organization with a huge number of people involved, so there would be candidates who would come through. I think one of the issues is that few of the other members of the FSLN have anything like the recognition factor of the two who are currently at the top, and the main figures from the past who were significant, maybe those who were actually active in the revolution back in 1979, are old or retired or
right.
no longer with us. So I think one of the things that needs to come out of this is a regeneration in terms of the leadership of the FSLN. I mean, I would also slightly like to comment on Natasha's thing about suggesting that Ortega is suppressing the opposition and that it's not free and fair elections. There are certainly irregularities with the elections. The Organization of American States has presented a report. A delegation is currently in Nicaragua discussing with the government how to implement them. The government is doing its best to implement revisions to the electoral system to make sure that the elections are as free and fair as possible. And it's also not true to say that there haven't been international observers. There have just been certain observers from certain countries who have been restricted.
Okay.
So I think the weakness of the opposition.
And just very quickly, James, we're down to kind of our last minute, and I want to get to Brandon too, but there was something that really struck me in these protests that I thought this must really hurt Ortega to hear from protesters. One of their slogans that they were chanting was, Ortega, Somoza son la misma cosa, saying that the man he fought against, Somoza, the dictatorship that he risked his life to fight against, now they are the same thing. That must have hurt him.
Yes, well, I mean, I don't know what the context of that is, how widespread that was. I presume that it was done as an angry protest because it specifically hurt. The idea that there is any comparison between a dictator who allowed no elections, who tortured and killed his own people, and siphoned off hundreds of millions of dollars which were given in aid to the country after the 1970s earthquake and so on, with a man who has led a government which has supported social programs, cut poverty and so on. The comparison is clearly absurd. Clearly Ortega's government has made mistakes. I hope that they will now be able to address those and genuinely take into account the wishes of the protesters. If they can do so, then hopefully that will alleviate the situation. Otherwise, there is a danger. There's also the danger of the right wing exploiting this situation, and there are suggestions that the right wing may have been involved in some of the violence in the protests.
Okay. Brandon, I just want to hear from you, since you are the Nicaraguan on the panel. You're a member of the young generation. Are you looking forward to the future of the country? Do you want to return to Nicaragua to be with your countrymen?
Definitely. You know, going back every other year, visiting family. You know, the culture in Nicaragua is amazing, but you know, seeing from what it's transitioned to, it's really been hard to keep quiet and not really speak up against this. I really don't really get political in this instance, but just due to the fact that there's family being affected and seeing how poverty has already been an issue. You know, I have family members that sleep under roofs that you can see right through. So, you know, living in those circumstances and already dealing with the tension that already exists in a regular space and seeing how it amounts to now that there's tension coming from all angles, it's a very difficult circumstance to really deal with. And that's why SOS Nicaragua has been the hashtag that has been raising awareness to this situation. So for me, I want to go back to my country, even if it is anytime soon, just to keep raising awareness, because it's just something that's really unfortunate. And I really hope that things get adjusted really soon.
Okay. I'd like to thank James, Natasha, and Brandon all so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Still to come on the program, outrage in Spain after a group of men is acquitted of rape. Are judges ignoring sexual assault? And we look at how an extreme belief in misogyny likely inspired the deadly van attack in Toronto. Well, mass demonstrations in Spain are calling for the government to change the legal definition of rape. Protesters there were outraged after a group of men calling themselves the Wolf Pack were convicted of the continuous sexual abuse of a teenage girl. The victim says she was gang raped, but a Spanish court sentenced the men to 9 years in prison on a lesser charge because the victim, possibly paralyzed by fear, didn't say no and didn't fight back. With more, here's Sandra Gatman.
They're outraged and fed up. over a legal case in which 5 men were acquitted of gang rape, a group who called themselves La Manada, the Wolf Pack. The sexual assault took place in 2016 at the Pamplona Bull Run. An 18-year-old woman says she was forced into an alley and sexually assaulted by 5 men who filmed the act on their cell phones. The men's attorneys say the videos reveal the victim was passive and submissive, evidence they say that she consented.
A la pena de 9 años de prisión.
The case has consumed public attention in Spain since then, and last week's court decision not to charge the men with rape was too much for thousands of women all over Spain.
Que todavía estemos en un país como en el que estamos, que en pleno siglo XXI estén diciendo que es un mero abuso.
The Wolfpack case has put a spotlight on Spain's criminal code and its definition of rape. In many European countries, rape is defined by an absence of consent. But under Spanish law, rape must involve violence or intimidation. Judges handling the case ruled the victim did not experience either. Instead of the 22-year sentence prosecutors were seeking for gang rape, the 5 men were sentenced to 9-year terms for continuous sexual abuse. Spain's government and opposition parties say it's time to change the laws.
Hay que hacerla, hay que contar con todos los grupos políticos y así será. Se trataría de una modificación de una ley orgánica, evidentemente. Pero creo que esa iniciativa del Ministro de Justicia muestra bien a las claras esa voluntad de luchar firmemente contra ello.
The case has also reignited criticism of the Bull Festival's history of sexual assault, as well as Spain's problem with an ingrained macho culture, gender-based violence, and domestic abuse that kills dozens of women every year. It's also led to an online Me Too movement of Spanish women sharing their own stories of sexual abuse. So is this all positive momentum towards much-needed change? Or, as critics argue, does the Wolfpack case deserve more scrutiny? Sandra Gatman, The Newsmakers.
Well, let's bring in our guests now. And joining me from Barcelona is Irene Alvarez Sanchez. She's an attorney specializing in sexual violence against women. And also in Barcelona is Magda Bandera, editor-in-chief of the monthly newspaper La Marea. Thanks both so much for joining us. Our tragic reality here is that women are abused and raped really every day all over the world. But why has this case in Spain caused such national outrage and garnered such international attention? Let me start with Irene.
Yes, in Spain, from long time, I can mark you the issue of the violence law in 2004. This law changes many things in Spain because the violence against women finished to be a private question and began to be a public question. This was a responsibility of the state to protect women even inside their own houses.
Right, okay, we'll get to the legal issues too, but I just wanted to ask Magda on that first question. Tell us why, Magda, you think this particular case has led to the national outrage we've seen across Spain, as well as the international attention that it's garnered as well. Why this case?
I agree with Irene that after 8th of March, women in Spain have felt empowered. Somehow that changed many things. We were over 5 million women going on a strike, and we shared spaces, and we really demonstrated and felt that things had to change. And then many topics were we had arguments, we were talking to each other, and sexual harassment and aggressions were on the agenda. So we were all waiting for this case because it was really very bad. It means we have been, as Irene said, for past years, we have been protesting the way media talk about women who are killed by men. They say a woman dies. No, and we are beginning to change language, saying, no, a woman is killed, a man has killed. All these things have been little by little changing this. And then we were waiting because we never talk before that way about sexual harassment. What happened to us, that we are afraid of going alone in the night, in the streets, all these things. And to say the slogan, if we don't resist, they don't believe us. But if we do resist, they kill us, was very strong.
You know, Magda, it's interesting because, I mean, Spain, from the outside, does not have a reputation at all for being any sort of a dangerous country for women or a place that's unsafe and that it treats rape lightly. It's in line, its laws are in line with EU regulations. But then you're telling us maybe the problem really is, and as our reporter mentioned in her report, there's an issue specifically in Spain with macho culture, gender-based violence, and abuse. Domestic abuse specifically.
Yeah, we have access, it's true, we don't have these so many reports on rapes or aggressions. But it's because of this culture. Many women now, we had a kind of in Twitter, there was something 3 days ago called Cuéntalo, tell it. A journalist just sent this message in Twitter to say, tell us what you have suffered during your life with sexual aggressions. And it was amazing. In less than 48 hours, there were over 250,000 testimonies saying what we are suffering every day with our bosses, inside of a couple who is married. And this kind of aggressions, women as my mom never thought that was also, she has also to consent to have a sexual relationship, no? And that is what it has changed. For instance, in Sweden, you have many more people, women going to the police to say they have been assaulted.
Okay.
We had to change this macho culture, you say.
Right. I mean, Irene, I imagine you're on the same page here. You know, laws do have to change, but also culture has to change in Spain as well.
Well, I think the culture, the macho culture, is not just one of the causes, one of the reasons why it has increased the violence against women. Maybe also the improvements the woman has made into work, economy, to get to the level of men in general. The figures are very clear. More than half of the judges are women. More of half of the students at university are women. This pressure, there are studies that express that it's also that has created an increasement of the violence against women, because men see as a menace, as an attack from them.
Okay. I imagine that the women in Spain as well are picking up on the momentum of the international Me Too movement, and especially what we've seen in the United States, yes, with the more and more women coming out against even more powerful men and saying enough is enough, we won't be treated this way.
Yes. We want to really be equal. We want to be free. We want to decide. That's why it is really, apart from the legal question that has put into the table this decision, apart from the call to the courts to feel with a special sensibility to these cases, there is a question very important in my view, that one woman has arrived to courts with this case.
So the laws, when they specify that there has to be specific actions taken by the women, are really unfair.
What is not difficult to modify at the law is the consent. When the behavior arrives to a level that it's very hardly against the dignity of the person, the consent has to be expressed. We cannot deduct there is a consent because there is not a reject.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let me ask Magda, though, because there's another issue here, and that so many of these protesters, Magda, were demanding tougher sentences for sexual assault, for rape. And the problem with that is that there can be a double-edged sword, as we say. The problem here is that when you lock up these offenders, they don't necessarily come out rehabilitated. In fact, they can come out as even more dangerous criminals. Magda, how are you looking to address that? How can prevention be more of an issue here than instead of prosecution?
How to prevent this kind of attacks, you mean?
Yes, I mean, because the problem is you put them in jail and they can come out worse. Yes. So what could be another approach to ensure that they don't reoffend or come out as more aggressive and angrier at women?
Well, actually, they can have some kind of education in prison. And these cases, well, they are not, the bad thing of that all is that they are not, they have an illness. They just are really machos who have an education problem. That's why we're saying in judges, people, children need a gender education. We have to this about this kind of gangs like the wolf pack. That's something trendy now, and there is not only this case but a lot. And the way they share all these experiences in a WhatsApp group, it's really what it has made a shock in the whole society. It's really now what it was really nice on last Thursday in this massive protest against this verdict is that the streets were full with men saying that's not an abuse, that's rape. And they were men who didn't want to be the main character. They followed us. They listened to us for not the first time, but they don't listen too often. So I think men have to be now leading their own protests and really saying to their colleagues, their friends, no, that's not the way we have to treat women. Because we women, we are not going to bear this any longer. So I think we have to have a special education in all ages, and men have to accept they have a problem. We suffer their problem, but the problem are the victims.
And Magda, I want your thoughts then on what legally you think needs to change in Spain. You've talked about changing the culture, education being an issue. Legally, what needs to change?
We need to talk about rape with all the letters. It's not abuse or assault. We need. We don't understand why they have they are afraid of saying this word. So consent, as Irene said, is the most important thing. When you say abuse, you also think women. The woman has not accepted, has just not said no directly. But it could be, like you said, Andrea, she's just scared. She doesn't want anything but going as quickly as she can. So our judges need to have also this point of view, this with women, how we react when we are so scared. What is really consent? Not like they thought in these laws that are too old, a long time ago they were made.
Okay. Irene, final thought from you. What needs to change exactly? What steps need to be taken now to go forward?
In a legal basis, as Magda says, it's a good idea to talk again about rape and to stop with these words, abuse, aggression. That was it's remarkable that this new definition comes from 1995 with a new criminal code. It is not has been ever. It had before 1995 there was rape and violación. But after the new criminal code in 1995, there was a socialist government, it had changed, well, probably with a good intention, but it has introduced some confusion, as we see now.
Right. Okay.
The consent has to be, yes. In this, that is what I wanted to say related to legal and related to the social. It's seen to carry on this, to go on this movement. The society has to understand that women have to have the same rights and have to be considered by men and by other women as equal persons, and we have to be in society at the same level as men. And all the things that against this position are rejectable.
Okay, Irene, I will let you have the last word. I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers.
Thank you. Thank you.
It has been a pleasure.
Obviously, all Canadians continue and will continue to have questions about why this happened, what could possibly be the motives behind it. As was indicated last night by our Public Security Minister, at this time we have no reason to suspect that there is any national security element to this attack.
Well, now we know that the driver accused of killing 10 people and injuring 15 others in Toronto, Canada last week may have been motivated by an extreme form of misogyny. In a Facebook post published before the attack, suspect Alec Manassian referred to the Incel rebellion. Now, Incel is short for involuntarily celibate, and it's a term used by an online community of men who blame women for their non-existent sex lives. Manassian had praised fellow Incel subscriber Elliot Rodger, who killed more than a dozen people in 2014. Incel groups online push the idea that women are only attracted to hypermasculine men, and some advocate violence as a way to change that. Well, to better understand the phenomenon, I'm joined now by Donna Dawson, who's a behavioral psychologist from London. Thanks so much for speaking to us, Donna. I mean, first of all, tell us who really are these men, and how many are there?
Well, there are several online groups, as far as I know. Difficult to tell what the numbers are, but apparently it's composed mostly of teenaged boys who are frustrated and lonely. And there are other issues involved here, extreme bullying, feeling cut off from society. That coupled with a sense of entitlement. So if you link entitlement with low self-esteem and a fatalistic outlook on life, whereby you feel you can't improve yourself or everything's against you, it's a really toxic mix. But it's lonely, sad people, mostly, well, it's men, who are coming together online to form communities, and instead of helping each other through their issues, are letting their kind of anger and frustration at women and society in general just kind of fester, so that at some point their action is taken of a violent kind to kind of do something, to make a statement.
Right. These online forums really seem to fuel that misogyny. I want to go back to that in a second, but what you said was really interesting about it's one thing to be frustrated by the fact that you're not getting what you want from women and you can't have a proper romantic relationship, but the fact that they feel so entitled to it, that women actually owe them. Where does that come from?
This is a very strange phenomena. I would have said, I noticed this as a trend happening in the 80s. We had the me generation in the 80s where everybody felt they were entitled to happiness and they would take shortcuts to get there. That's when the divorce rate went up, when people were looking for quickie divorces and the next marriage to help them gain what they thought was their right to happiness. Now, whether that in turn has produced children who feel the same way, but I think the social media has got to take some blame here, because you go online and you see people's portraying themselves in an idealistic sort of way. I have this, I have that, I look like that. And a lot of it isn't real. A lot of it is, photographically touched up. It's exaggerated. You can be who you want to be online. And if you buy into that, you begin to feel particularly if you're not playing that game, you begin to feel inadequate yourself. You begin to feel you can't compete. But there are also bigger issues because social media, unfortunately, reflects the world we also live in. It seems a lot of these boys were bullied at school. And looking online, too, it looks like their relationships with women are pretty fractured. Reading into some of the types that they developed, the kind of nerdy incel type, some stuff that was written about that, it looked as though the mothers were overly powerful and strong, the fathers were weak and flabby, sisters were bullying and emotionally abusive, mothers may have committed crimes. There was all kinds of hidden issues going on with understanding the opposite sex, with relating to them, with not feeling nurtured. I would be very interested to know whether the killer, the Toronto killer, had a kind of fractured family background, whether he got on with his mother, whether he had sisters or female relatives he didn't identify with. There's something deeper here.
Right. As you were saying before,
it isn't about sex.
Right. And fueling some of the more kind of extreme actions they take and reinforcing the misogyny is that they realize they're not alone. They find this support online, on that online community. That really is dangerous.
I think the danger, too, online networking and social websites is that you can find like-minded individuals and you can group together and it somehow validates your view because you think, oh, I'm not alone in feeling this. I must be okay, this must be right. And there will always be a percentage that will topple over into action. So it doesn't just stay fermenting and people complaining to each other. Some people will take action, and that's true of any emotion and any issue.
Right, so sometimes those online communities are great when people genuinely need support and they are lonely, but there are the elements that run into dangerous territory. Let me ask about something else at play here. Yes. As I've heard, there are some members of the community that some behavioral psychologists think suffer from autism, the kind of functional autism that lets them hold a job, look like normal members of society, but they can't function socially, and they look instead for tangible things to blame for their social discomfort and their inadequacies, when the truth is they can't control or change that. Now, how can that be addressed?
Well, you see, I think, yes, I'm familiar with autism and the autistic spectrum, and there is a lot more diagnosing going on of what we would have called maybe social personality issues a few years ago. We're putting it on the autistic spectrum. I don't know how helpful that is because at the end we have to address all of this. The main problem behind what's happened, I think, in Toronto are men who can't form relationships. There's no such thing as, I can't get sex. All men can get sex. They can pay for sex. They can go to prostitutes. It's not about that. It's about how they've attached the feeling of entitlement to the opposite sex and why they feel they need to be given what they need. And this is an autistic trait, I have to say. When you don't understand that you can't be given what you need. You know, I've seen that in my own grandchildren.
Okay.
So the issue here, but they can learn. The thing is, you can learn to behave socially. And what we need to do in society is to address, where do these people go? Where do they go online? Where are the relationship forums that help people learn to form relationships? Where are the relationship classes in schools that help you to understand that before you have sex, you have to form a relationship? And how do you do that?
Right. Donna, ideally, if you could intervene in one of these online groups and talk to these men, what would you do?
I would ask them about their experiences with the women in their lives, with their mothers, with their sisters, with female teachers, with possible girlfriends they wanted, and ask them where they think it went wrong and what they think they can do about it. Because what bothers me is all of these men feel doomed. They're fatalistic. They don't feel they can control or make any changes in their lives. You know, what is it about them that they feel genetically inferior? What is it they feel they can't change? Why do they feel their lives are not under their own control, when indeed they are? Because this is a terribly bad mixture. When you feel not in control and there's nothing that can be done, and you are up against a wall, you will react with frustration, anger, and violence. So you need to know there are steps you can take to improve yourself, to love yourself again, to make yourself lovable and able to form relationships, you need to look at self-worth, self-confidence, the ways they feel they can get back in control of their lives. People who are 7-stone weaklings go to gyms and build themselves up.
Right.
People with personality difficulties can go to, well, hopefully, a relationship forum of some kind, or learn from other couples. There are answers out there, but it's almost as if they've refused to address them.
Okay, Donna, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I'd like to thank you so much for joining us on The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Lebanon prepares for its first election in almost a decade. Do political newcomers now stand a better chance? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.